It's my pleasure to open this event. My name is Michael Sells. I teach in the Divinity School in Comparative Literature. And I'll just say a few words about the program under the auspices of which this event is happening. This is the 5th year of 6 years of Mellon support for what we call the Mellon Islamic Studies Initiative, which brings distinguished scholars from around the world to campus to teach and to offer a lecture. And I want to mention in that regard and give special thanks to Deans Margaret Mitchell and Rick Rosengarten of the Divinity School, who are so essential in developing the proposal and getting the grant going, and also to our steering committee, which has had an involvement from a number of departments across campus. In particular, to our coordinator this year and the past couple of years, Nora Jacobson Ben Hammett, who's standing there, I guess, running the camera today, and to Bill Tarasi, who's done so much work for us in setting up audiovisual, and of course this year to the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations, which are hosting our speaker. And this interesting sound has been punctuating my life today, and someday perhaps I'll get the true secret of what it is. But having said that, I'm now happy to turn over the floor to Professor Muzaffar Alam, who will introduce our speaker. Professor Alam.
Thank you very much. I feel honored having been asked to introduce Professor Francis Robinson. I first met Professor Robinson in 1980 at the Institute of Historical Research, London University. Since then, we have been friends. I have benefited enormously from his wonderful scholarship of South Asian history and Islam. Professor Robinson, at present, he is Professor of South Asian History at Royal Holloway College, University of London. Over the last 4 decades, he has published enormously. 14 books, 8 authored, 4 edited, and about 100 articles in journals, edited volumes, and encyclopedias. Most of his writings have been on issues pertaining to the culture and politics of Muslims in South Asia, their interaction with the larger world of Islam, and the ways they and also the world of Islam dealt with the challenges of Western modernity. As a leader of a scholar of the field and as a dedicated teacher and generous mentor, he has influenced and inspired a generation of scholars. As chair, dean, director, president, vice president, and key member of several high academic institutions in England, he initiated and enabled the building of a variety of new areas of research on Islam and South Asia. During the last 25 years that he has been associated with the Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain, he has reorganized the Society's prestigious journal, arranged and supervised the publication of a large number of notable books on Islam, Asia, and Africa, and has also been a driving force behind making available in print several volumes of Greek and Zimar Ottoman historical literature. I may mention very briefly, of course, some of his publications. His first book, Separatism Among Indian Muslims, published in 1974, still continues to be an important entry point for anybody to understand the reasons why Indian Muslims under British rule organized for politics as a separate community, why they insisted on their separate identity, which led eventually to the foundation of Pakistan, and also to many of the troubles and problems which beset the subcontinent even today. His another book, Ulama of Frangi Mahal and Islamic Culture in South Asia, focuses on numerous unexplored avenues of the developments of the second great culture of the Islamic world, namely the Perso-Islamic culture in South Asia. The book illustrates how this culture rested on Persian language and literature, on the rationalist traditions of Perso-Islamic scholarship, and on formal and mystical learning together with their systems of transmission which the Frangi Mahal scholars we know and saints consolidated in India in the 18th century. Professor Robinson goes in this book far beyond the colonial archives and avoiding the hazards of hagiography demonstrates how by using family records and private papers of a religious and priestly family we can address the big question of social history of South Asia and Islam in modern times. In another book, Islam and Muslim History in South Asia, he highlights the dynamism and the complexity of the relationship between Islamic law and practice, the implications of conversion and secularization for and the impact of print on South Asian Islam. While in a recently published volume, Islam, South Asia and the West, he focuses on the background to the interactions of Islam, South Asia and the West, the shape that the British power and Muslim revivalism gave to the modern Muslim world, and the great shift from an otherworldly to this worldly piety amongst Muslims, the energy that this has given the Muslim revival. A number of Professor Robinson's books also give us a refreshingly critical and succinct synthesis of comparative history of religious and intellectual developments over nearly the whole of the Muslim world. Notable in this category is his Atlas of the Islamic World since 1500. Rated as an outstanding academic and reference book, it deals the transmission of Islamic culture from generation to generation and from state to state over the last 500 years. Among the other titles in this category, I should mention the Cambridge Illustrated History of the Islamic World, the Mughal Emperors and the Islamic Dynasties of India, Iran and Central Asia. And more recently, in Volume 5 of the new Cambridge History of Islam, where he has brought a team of notable scholars to explore the Muslim response to the challenge of Western domination across the last 200 years, Professor Robinson offers also substantial guidance for further study of Islam and Indo-Muslim culture, which amongst his colleagues and friends were his own four forthcoming volumes, including a comprehensive biography of the last great Frangi Mahal scholar and saint, Maulana Jamaluddin Abdul Wahab, and numerous articles promise to push a step further. Professor Robinson speaks today on the building of Islamic societies from below since 1800. Please join me in extending warm welcome.
Thank you, Professor Allen, for that too generous introduction. For 1,000 years and more, as Bernard Lewis once put it, Islam walked hand in hand with power. The basic infrastructure of Islamic societies, mosques, madrasas, the administration of the law, the wider activities of ulama, were for the most part supported by Muslim political power. Some religious institutions which played an important part in popular Islamic life, for instance Sufis, shrines of Sufi saints, at times strove to distance themselves from the wielders of political power. On the other hand, the powerful usually sought to patronize the Sufis, and sometimes the Sufis were happy to be patronized. For 1,000 years and more, Muslim power and the Islamic infrastructure of Muslim societies were closely intertwined. This all changed with the spread of Western power and influence through the Muslim world. Key moments in this process were Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 and Wellesley's conquest of the last major Muslim power in India at Seringapatam in 1799. From now on, the European tide flowed faster. The British were the hegemonic power in India by 1818 and had conquered all of it by the mid-19th century. At the same time, the British and Dutch completed their conquests of Malaya and Indonesia. In the 30 years before World War I, the British, French, Germans and Italians divided Muslim Africa between them. During World War I, the British and French divided the Middle East between them. And at the same time, the Russians completed their conquest of the Caucasus and of Central Asia. By 1920, in what remained of the Muslim-ruled world, the Iranians had been subject to a humiliating treaty by the British, and the remnant of the Ottoman army was fighting for its life in Anatolia as the great power started to dismember. The only lands free of Western power were Afghanistan, North Yemen, and what is now Saudi Arabia. Western power meant an assault on the Islamic infrastructure of Muslim societies. In South Asia, British power meant an end of government support for Islamic education. The British saw no point in good revenue being used to support learning, which, after their utilitarian fashion, they considered worthless. So steadily in Bengal and northern India, they resumed the grants which sometimes for centuries had supported Islamic learning. By the same token, they no longer found room in their bureaucracy for men of Islamic learning. The training of an alim, a Muslim learned man, was no longer a route to government service. From now on, Muslims had to acquire Western knowledge and pass British exams if they were to rule. On occasion, the British also removed the the government grants which supported Sufi shrines. But not always. The British noted that landed Sufis in Sindh and in the Punjab might be bulwarks on which their power might rest. At the same time, the British imposed English law in the public sphere, narrowing down the sphere of Islamic law to the personal law, that involving marriage, divorce, and inheritance. Even this became increasingly anglicised, as first the advice of Islamic legal experts, ulama, in the form of qadis, was removed from court proceedings, and second, the law itself became increasingly divorced from its Islamic starting point, as the application of common law principles of justice, equity, and good conscience were applied by British judges. South Asian Muslims came to live at an increasing distance from the sources of revelation which should inform an Islamic society. In the Ottoman Empire, and subsequently Republican Turkey, there was a similar development. The process began in the 19th century Tanzimat, as the Ottomans, heavily influenced by the Count Napoleon, reconstructed public life, most notably making all citizens, Muslim and non-Muslim, equal before the law. The process was continued with a vengeance from the 1920s, with the struggle for Turkish Republic. The abolition of the Caliphate in 1954 was followed by the abolition of the Sheikh al-Islam, the Islamic Chief Justice, the abolition of the religious hierarchy, the replacement of Sharia law by European legal codes, which, amongst other things, brought an end to polygamy, Islamic divorce, and the introduction of civil marriage. The madrasas were closed, which meant the end of education in the formal knowledge of Islam. The Sufi lodges were closed, which meant the end of training in the spiritual understandings of Islam. The government took control of all religious endowments. In the same way, it took control of over 70,000 mosques. Individuals were pressed into Western dress as opposed to more modest Islamic dress. They were told to abandon the Islamic canon in favour of the Western one. They were literally instructed by Ataturk to give up their cursed Islamic script in favour of the Roman script. The fabric of an Islamic society, built up over hundreds of years, was reduced to tatters. What took place in British South Asia and in Turkey was replicated in most other Muslim societies. In Indonesia under the Dutch, in the Caucasus and Central Asia under Russia, the Soviet Union, in Iran under the Pahlavis, and in the European rule of North Africa. There is one notable exception to this, and that is northern Nigeria. Here the British, as always short of resources, rested their rule on the Hausa chiefs of this Islamic society of long time. In consequence, Sharia law was sustained by the state, as well as Islamic education. Leaving northern Nigeria to one side, the completeness of the change brought about by the presence of the West, its overwhelming nature, the way in which many of the structures on which an Islamic society might depend have been rubbed out, is summarized by the poet Akbar el-Hawaii, writing in India in the late 19th century. He declares, "They hold the throne in their hand. The whole realm is in their hand. The country, the apportioning of men's livelihood, is in their hand. The springs of hope and fear are in their hand. In their hand is the power to decide who should be humbled and who exalted. Our people is in their hand. Education is in their hand. If the West continues to be what it is, and the East what it is, we shall see the day when the whole world is in their hand." And then he makes the point rather more poetically thus: "The minstrel, and the music, and the melody have all changed. Our very sleep has changed. The tale we used to hear is no longer told. Spring comes with new adornments. The nightingales in the garden sing a different song. Nature's every effect has undergone a revolution. Another kind of red falls from the sky. Another kind of grey grows in the field." What I want to do is to examine Muslim responses to this shattering change. In particular, I want to examine our responses to the degrading or destruction of what we might term the infrastructure of an Islamic society. We should note that these responses were informed, for the most part, by the great movement of revival and reform in the Muslim world, which began to gather way in the 16th and 17th centuries and spread throughout it in the 18th and 19th. It had bases in the ideas of Ibn Taymiyyah of Damascus, in Ibrahim al-Qurani's school of Hadith in Medina, and subsequently in the ideas of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahab. It also had bases in the thinking of Sheikh Ahmed Hindi in South Asia, and his spiritual successors in the Naqshbandi Mujahidi line not least amongst them Shah Wali of Delhi and his family. Prime features of this movement were an emphasis on direct engagement with the Quran and Hadith, often circumventing great weight of medieval scholarship, an assault on Sufi practices, in particular those that suggest that Sufi saints might intercede to man with God, and bound up with this, an attack on Ibn Arabi's concept of the unity of being. These ideas spread through the Muslim world along the connections of ulama and Sufis. Recently, the Indonesian scholar, Dr. has traced these connections in detail as they reach from West Asia to North and West Africa, and also as they move into Central South and Southeast Asia to China. I like to think of these connections as the arteries and veins of the Muslim world, along which the life-giving course of Islamic knowledge travels. I shall begin by looking at the Muslim responses in South Asia. There are good reasons for this. South Asian Muslims had arguably the largest and deepest interactions with the West. In consequence, they were particularly productive in generating new ideas and new organizations to sustain them. Representing 1/3 of the Muslim peoples of the world, they have been most effective transmitters of these new ideas and organizations to the world beyond South Asia. At the center of South Asian Muslim responses was what has been called the emergence of a willed or Protestant Islam, or a form of Islam which might, in the stand of Marshall Thompson, be called Sharia. At the heart of this process were the ulama of the madrasa founded in the Castle of Deoband, some 90 miles northeast of Delhi, in 1867. They were assisted by other groups of reforming ulama who took more extreme jurisprudential positions than the Deobandis and were less widely followed. The Ahmadis, the people of Hadith, and the Quran, the people of Quran. These reformers developed a new emphasis in piety. Believers were encouraged to engage directly with Scripture, which was translated into Urdu and other Indian languages. At the same time, any idea of intercession from man with God to saints tomb, or through angels, or the imams, was rejected out of hand. Muslims in this tradition were reminded of the horrors of the Day of Judgment, as Ashraf Ali Thamri did in his Behishti Zera, his Jewels of Paradise, his famous handbook for women, the prescriptions of which apply equally for men. Such Muslims were required to reflect every day on whether they'd done enough to follow God's guidance, to meet his high standards. The reformist God was certainly compassionate and merciful, as he always been, but he was also to be feared. Fear God was the very first practice sentence that women of the reformist tradition practiced as they were learning to read. Such Muslims were always adamant that whether they had done enough to be saved. Out of this newly fashioned piety, there grew a heightened sense of personal responsibility towards living a good Muslim life, and in the process helping to fashion an Islamic society. So in the absence of Muslim political power, the individual Muslim conscience was being shaped into the foundation on which an Islamic society would rest. This process also came to fashion an activist life, in which Muslims knew they had to act on earth in the light of God's guidance if they were to be saved. The reformers not only fashioned a new form of piety, they also fashioned new means of supporting it and transmitting it. At the centre of this process was the Deoband Madrasa. It depended entirely on subscriptions from the people. It rejected all subsidies from government. The ulama were now rooted as never before in society. They founded new madrasas in their tradition. By 1900, there were well over 30. They gave religious rights to the community in the form of fatwa, opinions on points of law. Muslims were encouraged to write from all over South Asia with their questions, and the Dewan Fatwa office would send out answers to the Imperial Postal Service. Dewan set to the work of translating the Quran, Hadith, and books in the classical Islamic tradition into Urdu and other vernacular language. They wrote books which reinforced their reformist understandings, biographies, collected biographies, pamphlets on contested issues, as well as comprehensive guides to reformist behaviour. South Asian Muslims had avoided Britain until the 19th century. Now, everything was published large scale to reach the widest possible market at the cheapest possible price. Deoband was a town of printing presses and bookshops. So too was the old Nawabi capital of Lucknow, where, as Ulrika Stock has shown us, Islamic publishing was very in business. These ulama stood up for their faith, engaging in set-piece debates with Christian missionaries and Hindu revivalists. Moreover, as they spread into the Kasbahs and local communities of South Asia, they preached their reform students with local minds and illustrated what it meant by the way in which they themselves behaved. At this point, we should note that although the tide was with them, the reformists were not the only producers of religious leadership at this moment of Western knowledge. There were the Bareilwis, the followers of Ahmad Reza Khan of Bareilly. They believed in intercession at saint shrines and followed many other practices which the reformers condemned. Theirs was a religious practice which embraced the deeply entrenched Sufi tradition of the South Asian world. They too began to found madrasas and produce literature and leadership. So too did the totally new sect, the Ahmadiyya, who emerged from a cauldron of economic change and religious competition in the late 19th century Punjab. Their leader, Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian, claimed that he was the Messiah of the Christian and Muslim traditions, as well as being an avatar of Krishna. Apart from this, his beliefs were not very different from those of the reformists, except that he claimed prophet. This made him anathema to most Muslims. But he gained followers who were renowned for their missionary work, and still are. Having introduced you to the early attempts of South Asian Muslims to rebuild their society and work through the work of madrasas and through reaching out directly to society, let me now demonstrate what happened to this initiative as the 20th century developed. In one sentence, the numbers of madrasas exploded. During the first half of the 20th century, their number would have been less than 1,000. By the end of the century, there were 80,000, perhaps many more. Accurate numbers are hard to establish. Sometimes madrasas have resisted registration, and others, maktabs or primary schools, have been registered, which would not produce fully fledged children. Nevertheless, although we cannot be precise about numbers, we can be sure that they have vastly increased and well out of proportion to the increase in population. Let us consider this process in slightly greater detail. In Pakistan, at independence, there were 189 madrasas. By 2002, there were at least 10,000, of which 7,000 were Deobandi and 1,600 were Bareilly. The reasons for their growth were several. Poor Pakistani families found madrasas which offered not just education, but board for their sons most attractive. The state, which spent 3 times what the feds wanted spent on education, failed to provide satisfactory public education at the local level. To these factors should be added Saudi and Gulf funding for madrasas, an enabling environment under the Islamizing regime of General Zia al-Haq, The use made both by Pakistan and the West of madrasas and their human materials to resist the invasion of Afghanistan, the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, and the growing value they had from the 1980s as pools of supporters for those engaged in Pakistan's increasingly sectarian politics. Many were the forces driving the growth of madrasas. But before we leave Pakistan, we should note one particular outcome of Deobandi activism. That is the work of their madrasas in creating a Sunni infrastructure in eastern Iran. Divinity CMRS in Paris has recently demonstrated how the Deobandi spread from Karachi into Iranian Balochistan, making the Jamia Darul Uloom Zahedan a great centre of its function. From here, with the support of both the Pahlavi and the revolutionary regime, they spread their madrasas through the region and into Sistan, Khorasan, and Central Asia. Under Khomeini, they were given permission to run their own Sharia courts. It would appear that the central government in Tehran preferred to deal with law-abiding Sunni ulama as regional representatives rather than with their fractious private leaders. The outcome was the further spread of the infrastructure of a Sunni Islamic society. In Bangladesh, madrasas have always been part of the state provision. There are two main types: the Alia madrasas, which are state-funded and teach secular subjects alongside the Quran Hadith, and the Qawmi madrasas, modelled after the Deobandi pattern, and therefore privately funded and focusing on a religious curriculum. Between 1972 and 2002, the Alia madrasas grew from about 1,500 to well over 8,000, and the Qawmi madrasas from 1,500 to nearly 12,000. Amongst the reasons for this development were failure of the state, as in Pakistan, to provide effective education at the lowest levels of society. The enabling atmosphere created by the Islamizing regime of General Zia-ul Rahman, as he sought legitimacy after overthrowing the founders of Bangladesh. The remittances of Bangladesh's migrant workers, as they sought respectability in their villages by supporting religious education, and the work of large numbers of Islamic NGOs. As in Pakistan, some madrasas and their ulama organizations became caught up in politics. Some, for instance, on the borders of Chittagong, became involved in Rohingya militancy. In India, it would appear that the number of madrasas had risen from a few hundred at independence to over 40,000 at the beginning of this century. In explaining this, we need to remember the poverty of Indian Muslims, who are for the most part an oppressed minority. As in Pakistan and Bangladesh, madrasas make up for the failure of the social education system. There are said to be 30 million school-aged children out of school. But for Muslims, by preserving Urdu and Muslim manners, as they teach the classical madrasa subjects, they also preserve identity. Indian ulama still were clear of politics, although right-wing Hindu politicians have not been slow to draw their madrasas into politics for their own purposes. One of the elements of the Islamic society, which the madrasa world of India has supported, is the Imarat-e-Sharia organization of the states of Bihar, Jharkhand, and Orissa. Founded in 1921, in the midst of the Khilafat non-cooperation movement under the British, it established a separate legal structure outside the framework of the state to administer Islamic law. This, amazingly, was survived down to the present, administering personal law. The organisation arbitrates between litigants as a traditional Qadi might have done. It has no power to enforce outcomes depending on the fate of those concerned and perhaps social pressure for enforcement. It is a not inconsiderable organisation which so far the Indian state has permitted to exist. So, the number of madrasas in South Asia has grown substantially. In principle, this has meant a significant increase in those able to support the infrastructure of an Islamic society. How much weight we should give to this is difficult to say. The numbers of madrasas only give an indication of the possible number of madrasa students, which might vary from under 100 per institution to over 3,000 or more. Equally, we don't know how many students persist to the end of their course and emerge as fully fledged children. Nevertheless, we can be sure that the numbers of those able to play a part in sustaining the Islamic society have increased substantially. This said, the foundation of madrasas and the education of increasing numbers of ulama were not the only means of building an Islamic society in the world. There were also movements designed to fashion correct behaviour and sustain piety in society itself. One of these was the Tablighi Jamaat, or preaching society, which focused on reforming the individual and by this means society at large. It was founded in 1927 by a nearby scholar, Muhammad Ilyas, who wished to rescue Muslims whom Hindus had recently converted to Hinduism. Out of this there grew a vigorous Muslim missionary movement to Muslims at large. The basic aim was to call Muslims to improve their Islamic standards. Followers who paid their own expenses formed themselves into groups of 10 or jamaats. They then went to a specific area and by what they preached, how they dressed, how they behaved, called their fellow Muslims to Islam. All was modelled on the example of the Prophet Muhammad. Tablighis agreed to give a day of a week, a weekend every month, or 40 days a year to the cause of preaching. They are now said to form, although no one can be sure, membership records do not exist, the most widely followed movement in Islam, with 100 to 150 million. Its annual gatherings, which are said to be sources of great blessings to those who attend them, attract vast numbers. Over 1 million at Bhopal in India, over 1.5 million at Rawalpindi in Pakistan, and over 3 million at Tonga in Bangladesh. The movement, moreover, attracts support from all classes. In Pakistan, for instance, from leading generals and politicians down to humble apprentices. There are other Islamic movements. For instance, the Divinity School, founded by journalist and Islamic thinker Maulana Maududi. This organisation was to fashion an elite vanguard of the pure to transform Islamic society from within. Its branches in Pakistan, India and Bangladesh have relatively few members. Prospective members have to pass vigorous tests to belong. But it does have millions of sympathisers, particularly amongst the university educators. Having initially taken a conservative approach towards women's activism, the Jamaat now embraces their support. It runs women's organisations, women's reading, and even publishes romantic novels with Islamic messages. Its prime concern is to use the power of the state to press forward its Islamic purposes. It recognises that women have purpose equally with men. Yet another movement is Farhad Hashmi's Al-Huda organisation, which has gained considerable purchase amongst the middle and upper class women in Pakistan. Hashmi, an Arabic scholar who comes out of an Hadith background, is not popular with the ulama. They do not like a woman taking the lead in religious teaching. They're also unhappy about the privileged background of the Al-Huda members. I hope it's now clear how in South Asia, under colonial rule, and under the independent regime which followed, Muslims, for the most part, without political power, have taken control of the business of fashioning an Islamic society. Direct knowledge of Scripture, working together with the individual human conscience, was the basis. Tens of thousands of madrasas, funded by popular subscription, have helped to supply the infrastructure. Hundreds of thousands of students, with various levels of learning, poured out of these schools to act as a level, particularly at the lower levels of society. The privilege has made vast numbers of Islamic works available in vernacular languages and in cheap form. The work of preaching has been carried forward with great vigour by ordinary men and now increasingly by women. These developments have, of course, had an impact on public life. In some cases, madrasas have been supporters of sectarian movements, and indeed Islamic militants. The Divinity Islamic has achieved positions of influence, and occasionally been a member of governing coalitions in both Pakistan and Bangladesh. Islamic vocabulary has increasingly become part of the political discourse. Political scientists will rightly point out that there are many factors, both political and geopolitical, behind the Islamization of the politics of Pakistan and Bangladesh since the 1970s. But I have no doubt that part of the explanation lies in the construction of Islamic societies from below that I've set out. The same processes have been at work in India, but the situation of Muslims as a relatively small and oppressed minority has meant that their expression is very different. Let us now turn to Turkey. You will recall that under Ataturk, much of the infrastructure of Islam was expunged from society. Yet, as in South Asia, Turkey has seen a remarkable rebuilding of its Islamic structure in the land. In this case, the process owed nothing to the Ulama, it was the work of Sufis who survived Ataturk and the private piety of millions of individuals. As it happened, the initial spark for this process came from South Asia. The most important Sufi order in terms of building an Islamic society in the 20th century has been the Naqshbandiya. In the early 17th century, the Naqshbandiya in India had experienced an important renewal under Sheikh Ahmed Sirhindi, who I mentioned to you briefly earlier. His specific ideas were worked out in his resistance to the religious eclecticism of the Mughal emperors Akbar and Jahangir. They were contained in his Maktuba, his collected letters, written to the Mughals and their courtiers. Specifically, they supported his beliefs in the unity of God against various forms of heterodoxy. He was given the title Mujahid, or renewer of the second millennium of Islam. The Naqshbandi line that flows from him is known as the Mujahid. In the early 19th century, Sirhindi's Mujahidi tradition inspired Mullah Khalid of Baghdad, first to come to India to learn from Sirhindi's successors in Delhi, and then to found his own formation of the Naqshbandi Mujahidi, the Halidi. This was focused on the renewal of Islam and resistance to Western economic political penetration. It had followers throughout the Caucasus, Anatolia, the Crimea, and Istanbul. In the order, Sirhindi's Maktubat remained a central work of fact. All the Naqshbandiya manifestations of the 20th century Turkey flowed from the Halidis, who were credibly informed. Turgut Özal, Prime Minister who liberalised the Turkish economy in the 1980s, was an Naqshbandi. And Tayyip Erdogan, current president, Sultan, as some would call him, is an Naqshbandi. Let me introduce you to three offshoots of the Naqshbandiya Halidiya, which have been building Turkish Islam. The first is the Sulaimanis. the followers of Rajbandi Sheikh Suleiman Hilmi Tunahan, who died in 1959. With 4 million followers, they represent the second largest Islamic movement in Turkey. Their prime concern has been to sustain a traditional Hanafi Ottoman Islamic society against both Kemalist materialism and those who wish to unite Islam to political power, Islamism. In the high Kemalist era, they would need to read classical texts, in particular Seyyid Maktuba, in order to build an inner resistance to secular development. At the same time, although harassed by the authorities, they trained men to be imams and preachers. From the mid-20th century, they increasingly operated more publicly. They worked with the Democrat government in the 1950s in establishing imam public schools, now funded by the state, to train prayer leaders and preachers. From the 1980s, they focused particularly on youth, providing scholarships for university students and the largest and best equipped student dormitory network in the country. Their main supporters came from the growing and increasingly wealthy Turkish middle class, powered by the industrialization of Anatolia from the 1960s and by the liberalization of the Turkish economy from the 1980s. The most powerful force in building Turkey's Islamic society has been the Nurciman, the followers of Sayyid Bediüzzaman Nursi, who died in 1960. Occurred from Bitlis, near Lake Van, in southeast Anatolia. A brilliant young man, he tried unsuccessfully to persuade the Ottoman Sultan Abdülhamid II to support the foundation of a university in Van, teaching both modern science and Islam. He was also a supporter of the Young Turk Revolution. He had an excellent record in World War I, fighting the Russians in eastern Anatolia, and was a strong supporter of the subsequent Turkish liberation struggle. But in 1923, he separated from the Kemalist regime when he realized that Atatürk's aim was to separate the modern Turkish state and society from their Islamic heritage. He went through a major spiritual crisis. Assisted by reading Seyyid Maktuba and other works, he came to realize that man could only serve one man, and that was God. He left the Kemalist regime in Ankara and returned to Van to a life of contemplation, writing, and spiritual leadership. He now understood that the rejuvenation of Islamic society in Turkey must be carried out at the level of the individual. He aimed to fashion a new Turkish Islamic self, which will be reflective and which will be able to resist the destructive power of nationalism and materialism. So just as the Deobandi Muslims in India wanted to fashion an individual human conscience as the basis of an Islamic society under British rule, so Sayyid Bediüzzaman Nursi did the same in Turkish society under Kemalist. He was sent into eternal exile and frequently imprisoned. His means of transmitting his ideas was his Risale-i-Nur, his commentary on the Quran. As people were forbidden to read his writings, they could not be printed. Instead, they were copied by hand and delivered through much of Turkish society. It is said that as many as 600,000 copies were made. From the 1960s, Nursi's followers would come together in Dershans, a special apartment for single children, in which they would read out loud passages from Nursi's writings and discuss them. The readings would involve a continuous process of interpretation in relation to contemporary issues and events. The make-up of groups would depend on the locality in which the Dershani was placed. But typically, they might include small businessmen, lawyers, teachers, and students. Discussion would normally be led by laymen, government-paid religious functionaries were not taken seriously. In this environment, there was a club-like atmosphere. Businessmen might do business. But the weekly Darshani session had the impact of fostering a shared Islamic worldview and a heightened community consciousness. In the light of the business report, it's not surprising from the 1980s, the Nur Jews consistently defended Theodor Herzl's liberalizing policies and the withdrawal of the state from the educational and economic spheres. By the early 21st century, the Nur Jews had 5 million followers and 5,500 Darshani. They had the largest number of educated supporters in Turkey and also the strongest support amongst young people. To add to this, they developed major positions in publishing and in the religious media. The third which in fact is a branch of the Nur Jew movement, is that of Fethullah Gulen, born in 1951, known as the community of Fethullah Gulen. It is said to be the most influential Muslim movement in contemporary Turkey. Coming from a village near Erzurum, close to Turkey's borderlands with Russia, Gulen grew up regarding Islam and the state as protectors of his world. The son of a religious functionary, he went to work for the Directorate of Religious Affairs. By the mid-1960s, he'd come to develop his vision for enabling Islam to work as a leaven in Turkish society. To put this into practice, he aimed not to create a new class of ulama, but a new class of intellectuals, rooted in the Turkish Islamic tradition, but also able to engage with European Enlightenment thought. These intellectuals, moreover, were not to be the inwardly Islamic self-fashioners of saying Muslim, but Muslims of action. Muslims who realize their faith by action in the world. Gulen's constant theme has been action, which actually uses the word action. He invokes the mobilizing concepts Hizmet, rendering service, Hibbat, giving donations and protecting good work, and Ilhas, seeking God's appreciation of every action. Like the Suleimandras and the Nur Jews, Gulen's supporters came from the increasingly large and wealthy Turkish middle class. Alongside the businessmen and teachers, there were growing numbers of journalists. Gulen benefited greatly from the support of Prime Minister Theodor Herzl, who saw value in the fact that Gulen was both a nationalist Muslim, but had no desire to link Islam with the state. Herzl's liberalising of the Turkish system enabled Gulen's move into the media, his establishment of the national newspaper, Zaman, and the national television channel Saman Yolu. It also enabled him to establish business associations and, most of all, educational institutions. Education was at the heart of his mission. This was the way an activist Islamic polity was to be established. As it was not possible to teach religion outside the Imam Public schools, Gulen's followers taught Islam by contact. His educational network supports 6,000 teachers, 200 high schools, about 80 university preparatory schools, and 7 universities in Turkey and Turkey, Central Asia. English is the primary language in the classroom, and his students are notably successful in getting into university. These formal institutions are supported by a widespread informal network of Darshani, where college students provide religious education and educational and social support to their peers. Such has been Gulen's success that governments have become concerned about the size of his organisation within the state. In consequence, even though he defended the military crackdown after the soft coup of 1997, the military regime moved against him, and he was forced into exile in this country. In 2015, Tayyip Erdogan, whose Justice and Development Party Gulen had supported throughout the 21st century, decided that Gulen's followers had too strong opposition with the police and judiciary and began a witch hunt against them. Last weekend, in May, Erdogan closed Gulen Samar national newspaper. So the Turks have built a major Islamic presence in civil society, in spite of that, and in spite of the Kemalist regimes which succeeded. It is a presence which has nothing to do with the administration of the Sharia, which was abolished by Ataturk, although it does have something to do with Islamically trained punishment. The numbers being trained in Imam Khatib schools rose from 220,000 in 1983 to over 500,000 in 1997. On the other hand, it is a presence which has all to do with the internalization of Islamic values by ordinary citizens and their expression in social action. A measure of its weight in Turkish society is the way in which Tayyip Erdogan's Islamically rooted Justice and Development Party has been able since 2002 to keep the Kemalists and the army on the margins of politics. Another measure of a slightly different kind is the way in which Erdogan was able to offer to Arab states during their spring the model of Turkey as a secular state ruled by an Islamically rooted party. As I indicated at the beginning of the section, the processes we can see taking place in South Asia and in Turkey can also be seen at work elsewhere in the Muslim world, although always subject to the pressures of local political contexts. Indonesia under Dutch rule saw a similar development from Brussels and Islamic organisation to that in South Asia. From 1912, they developed the Muhammadiyah, an organisation stimulated by the general process of Islamic reform and expressing an Islamic piety very similar to that of Delhi. Now it supports nearly 6,000 schools and has 29 million members. In opposition to the Muhammadiyah, second group, the Nahdlatul Ulama, was founded in 1926. Its views were very close to India's Bareilles. Now operating outside the framework of the state, it claims to have nearly 7,000 schools, to own 44 universities, and to have 50 million members. In the 1980s, as General Suharto began to demilitarize his new order dictatorship, he began to court the huge Islamic presence in Indonesia's civil society. He promoted Islamic values, supporting the development of a code of Islamic law, the founding of an Islamic bank, and lifting the ban on Bulgarian schools and government offices. He even went on Hajj, changing his name to Haji Muhammad Suharto. Whereas at the beginning of his reign, Suharto felt able to ignore Muslim sensitivities, the sheer presence of Islam in civil society meant that as time went on, he had to pay it increasing attention. Egypt offers another example of Islamization of the land. Here leadership came not from the ulama, who were government employees, but from Muslim intellectuals. In the context of British rule, in 1928, Hassan al-Banna founded the Muslim Brotherhood to instill the Quran and the Sunnah as a sole reference point for ordering the life of the Muslim family, community, and state. His aim was to drive Western influence on Egypt. This has been the aim of the Brotherhood, influenced by the ideas of South Asia's Maulana Maududi from the 1950s down to the present. Primarily funded by tithes from its members, through its work in supporting poor Egyptians, it won widespread support among students and middle classes, as well as the working class. Measures of its support in Egyptian society are, for instance, Egypt's referendum in 1981, which voted to make the Sharia the sole source of law, and the elections of the Arab Spring, which saw the Muslim Brotherhood's political wing become by far the largest party in the Egyptian parliament, and the election of the unfortunate Mohammed Morsi, Egypt's president, in 2000. As we know, the Egyptian military have overturned these results. But what they say about how the Egyptians have built their Islamic society from below remains unchanged. The capacities developed in building Islamic societies from below over the past 200 years have meant that Islam has been particularly well equipped to establish itself in new regions where the state is either neutral or hostile. Most of the notable organizations covered in this lecture have spread Islamic communities into Europe and North America. In Europe, where there were in 2014 roughly 44 million Muslims, the Muslim Brotherhood and all the South Asian organizations are significantly present. In North America, a particular prize goes to the controversial Administered, for being the first American Muslim community and building in Detroit the first purpose-built mosque in the United States. Turkey's Gula community has been active in establishing charter schools. Not a penny, to my knowledge, has been taken from the state, although the old Muslim ruler has taken a hand. Saddam Hussein supplying a mosque in Birmingham, England, and the Saudis made schools. I've tried to give you a picture of how, over the past 200 years, Muslim societies without political power have built Islamic societies from below. Of course, Muslims have always contributed to the Islamic infrastructure of their society. But the loss of power made it crucial that they did so. The achievement of the past 2 centuries has often involved turning inwards to fashion the self, to develop the individual conscience as the basis of a Muslim society. Moreover, as time has gone on, there's been the requirement that this self should be an activist self. The achievement has also involved massive projects in education at all levels, a willingness to embrace new technology, in particular print, has driven the process forward. So too has the willingness of millions of individual Muslims to invest their resources of time and money. There have been many acts of courage as individual Muslims have faced imprisonment, torture or death at the hands of secular and usually dictatorial regimes. The fashion of Islamic societies from below has been a profound achievement of piety, of humility, most of the time, and of selfless social service. Thank you.
So I would suggest that you will address the questions directly. That's what we'll do. And we have about a good 15, 20 minutes if we can stay that long for the discussion. One other suggestion. Someone ask the first question. Great. Yeah.
I'm happy to ask the first question. Francis, you made this very fundamental remark about South Asian Muslims being the one Muslim community that was most, intensely, engaged with the West and had the most contact with the West. So I get a very clear picture of how this happened at the level of organized Muslim, political Islam in South Asia. But I've always been wondering how this contact looked at the very local level. So if we take the example of the Deobandis or your Qurani Mehelis, which of course lived in colonial societies. So even as they toured England to the Muslim community, how much contact was there, with representatives of the colonial state, and how did the interactions with representatives of the colonial state work out at this very local level? Could you tell us a little bit more about this?
Well, that's an interesting question. First of all, I don't think we should restrict things to the colonial state.
Yeah.
We need to remember that there are missionaries present.
Missionaries, scholars,
And scholars. The missionaries are pretty considerable presence in United States of China. And frequently, in Punjab actually, you had to put up with missionaries actually speaking to you on the street. Rather a Salvation Army speakers like do now. So this certainly, I don't think anyone could escape the fact that there was a substantial foreign presence. Whether it was the presence of missionaries, whether it was the fact that you knew there was a district officer who had actually important things in your life took place there. But of course, you've also been reminded in Salvation, in the middle of the century, in the way in which the mutiny uprising took down, of the enormous power which the British could wield if they chose to. So, I really regard the suppression of the mutiny uprising as a major. Right, you wanted to pin them down into the villages, but let's just remember what happens in some of the big cities. I mean, huge areas of London, as you all know, are literally flattened in order to create fields of fire. The whole of the area which the old Mongol nobles used to live outside between the fort and Shah-Jahan, that was completely flattened too. So you had some very graphic examples of the power of certainly, if you look at the Maidan records, the ulama, they're very aware of the British presence, and many of them are concerned. That is, the sayings about their doings and sayings actually involve how they dealt wisely or unwisely with the British presence. So I offer you three examples. Another example would have been the court system. There is developed a massive market in land, the British are determined to try and get land into the hands of people who actually produce. That means there's a constant process of getting the court. So you're very aware that through the court procedures, your life, your lands have been lost. So I don't think the British are necessarily, or the state is necessarily very distant. You are aware, and sometimes it can be very difficult.
The question is some of the Islamic Messianic movement.
Sorry, I'm a bit deaf. Could you speak up?
Excuse me. Some of the Messianic movement, like the Mahdi's in the Sudan, does that fit in with this development we were talking about with these academics?
Well, not really. The Mahdi's movement in the Sudan does belong to the whole process of religious revival. Direct connections between Sufi leadership in the Hijaz in the 1830s and 40s and the Mahdi's movement in Sudan. You could see this as a way of And one problem here is the Mahdist movement is actually directed against Egyptian rule, but not necessarily against British rule, although British rule is there in the background. One could tie the Mahdist movement into it, but I must, as you see from what I've said, I don't tie it in very precisely in what I've said, but you can certainly tie it in. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was a very, it actually gave me a big picture of these various Islamic societies and the movements from below. And I really appreciated how you tied it all together with this sense of a loss of power. And then when you ended, you said that one thing that was common to this rise of movements from below was a focus on the individual, notions of piety, humility. Now, I want to hear a little bit more, first about the period between 1970 to now, and 1970 to now. So not so much, say the fall of the Ottoman Caliphate, but more the modern period. I'll just ask you a little bit about the differences between these different societies, because I couldn't tell from the analysis that you presented. I mean, aside from the fact that the Turkish one was more Sufi driven and the South Asian one was more ulama driven, I couldn't grasp what the major differences might be in these different Islamic societies, and what some of the ramifications of these differences are, particularly for our period now. Because we spoke about the past. You gave us some very useful statistics on the rise of madrasas and other networks, but I'm trying to grapple not so much with what is the same, but what is different about the societies.
Well, I did emphasize one area where things are very different, and that, of course, is India. But, of course, Muslims are very numerous, they're nevertheless an oppressed minority, and so behave in a rather different way. Muslim might behave elsewhere. Nevertheless, if you like, the attitudes which have developed before it in dealing with the British presence, that is, cultivation of the self, in fact, if you're going to make a Muslim society, it has to be through cultivating the inner self. You can't create it outside, although they do have some fortune with the Emirati Shariah organization. That trajectory turns out to be extremely useful in India after independence. They have no power, but nevertheless they can, through self-cultivation, continue to create a form of Muslim society. What I find fascinating is, you lose power, where do you get the resources in order to replace power? And I find this is a self-passion which takes place both in Turkey and in South Asia, an absolutely fascinating process. Now, you're also tempting to say, well, what's the difference between India and Pakistan? Yeah.
All of these, I mean, there were so many different units in the top. There was Turkey, Indonesia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. And I see the similarities. Okay.
Well, I can only speculate. I can't tell you precisely. I would expect the Lebanese have a very precise tradition, but nevertheless, particular ways of being often change in the terms what you're suggesting. So I would suggest if we knew more about what the Lebanese were thinking in Pakistan today, we might find a much less quietist approach to how we operate. Because, in a sense, they're able to move closer to power in Pakistan. So they don't have to operate in the same way. But I'm afraid I can't tell you that definitely. But I think it's a very good, your question is very good in the sense of enabling you, encouraging you to think about these changes. And as you probably know, many people, when considering the traditions of their as developed in India, are deeply shocked as to what has happened in madrasas based in the Northwest Frontier, where some very different ways of thinking and behaving. So the context, as you quite rightly say, is very different. Right, I want that.
I was wondering whether this, the opposition between state and society, you discussed this whole problematic within particular states, India, Turkey, Indonesia, Egypt, but especially in the contemporary period, and you yourself gave...
I'm just not hearing you. I'll have to count that, sir.
Am I not speaking loud enough? Or am I speaking too fast?
I'm hearing you.
No, I mean, your whole problematic of state and loss of state power is within particular states. India, Pakistan, Indonesia, Turkey, etc. And I wonder, especially in the current context, contemporary context, over the last few decades, whether this problematic of state and society is in fact more complicated. For example, you gave the example of how Pakistan madrasas are being used against the Soviets, ideologically in Afghanistan, and you also mentioned how the West was used. For example, many of the books used in these madrasas actually put in the US. And for example, in the case of Julian and Erdogan, the only cause you gave was of the state being very uncomfortable and they become too powerful. When in fact, of course, there's also the question of corruption.
So what's your question?
Well, the question is this. So right now, especially with Saudi Arabia, what's now going on with the Islamic State movement and all, you have external states deeply implicated in what seems to be a bottom-up movement.
Sure.
So it's not just within a particular state, but external states having a state.
I think that you mentioned. I was covering such a large area, you might have missed it, but I did mention the influence of foreign NGOs in Bangladesh and also the influence of the Saudis in the development of madrasas after the 1970s onwards in Pakistan.
Yes, and what I was basically pointing out apart from individual examples, which are more or less becoming the norm, where movements from below are harnessed by foreign states. Not just Islam, when you look at Ukraine and so on.
Well, I think one has to be careful about operating in too sweeping a fashion. For instance, let's look at Turkey. Are you going to suggest that any of those Turkish movements are influenced by outsiders?
Well, Erdogan says that like what's happening with the Julian movement, he has often accused foreign factors, foreign powers of country, overthrowing the ideas of the movement. I mean, that's a pretext to use it.
Well, let's be careful about it. Sorry,
yeah, my question is about your characterization of this as a bottom-up. My question is about your characterization of this as a bottom-up building. Because I could tell a similar story, and here I know the South Asian material a lot better, which would be much more akin to the instrumentalist, elitist reading of this, which is that Muslim politics, like ethno-nationalism, various other identity politics, are resources which compete the elites can draw on, whether they're in the state or not. So I'll give you a couple of examples. In Pakistan and Bangladesh, of course, you have the Zias, who they will see the state using Islam as a resource to bolster its own kind of claim to legitimacy. Elsewhere, I'm sure you could make a good case, for example, that this is what competing political parties do when they're out of power for popular legitimacy, knowing that this is a majority identity to mobilize. So Bangladesh, again, is a nice example where Awami League, Bangladeshi nationalism, is framed around Bengali side of things. Bangladesh Nationalist Party identity is much more about the Islamic side of this. So, I mean, could we not tell the same story framed around middle-class elites? I mean, these are all very well-educated, often international figures who are acting as the ideological mouthpieces of these So, I mean, is this not a bunch of elites competing for state resources and other resources and managing to bring along popular organizations towards the network?
I would say no. There's a big thing. But as far as I know, the colonial persons, which is the minority, by far operate in a typical daylight way. Not they pay anything for. Equally in Pakistan, where everyone is operating in a normal way, or not taking any, say, operation talent. That said, there was a time when General Zia Khan was seeking and he was trying out some I appreciate your sort of political science, but I think one mustn't be that this extraordinary political institutions from the world, which society at large is deemed far more support. And if you want to ignore that, I think you're missing something very important. Will I say again at the church?
I don't know exactly well enough, but I mean, overall it's also easy touching.
But no, I think the point is with cynical person what's going on. Actually, this is
I'd like to follow up on some of these conversations. In regard to Pakistan, firstly, the widespread allegations, I would even say assumptions, at least in the American press, that the more militant Divinity madrasas with Subio and other figures, and the militant Divinity political parties, we see vast funding from Saudi Arabia. And that has been going on pretty much since 1979, the mobilization of that community. And the second point about Pakistan that seems to challenge a little bit the notion of the humility and responsibility part is what is widely reported. And again, I don't know how this is measured, but what is widely reported as widespread support for the blasphemy codes that Yale pushed through that target anyone who can be viewed as insinuating anything to do against the Prophet Muhammad, which leads to a power differential where local actors who, for whatever reason, with the backing of larger networks, can silence people, and even if they're not actually executed, can pretty much end their prospects. So the two questions then would be the alleged massive funding of Pakistani Divinity education, and of course including the polygon, and the alleged widespread population of the blasphemy codes that lead to an extraordinary exercise of power where individuals can basically anathematize an individual and that individual. And so just a thought on those two.
Okay. Of course, you're right. And in addressing the other question, I should differentiated. Of course, the Saudis, said in answer to the point earlier, the Saudis were not in supporting the development process on the frontier. The extent to which that money was also leaked elsewhere in their money network in Pakistan, I don't know. Perhaps you do. Okay.
I'm not privy to these.
We don't.
Yeah.
But you're quite right about the amount of money that was into the frontier, particularly in Russian areas, as part of the process resisting the Russian invasion. So I'm being said that. But I wouldn't want my overall argument, in a sense, to be too thrown off course by we have to remember dealing with the process that's taking place over certainly over 150 years. And obviously we had some interesting developments over the past 30 years, which might suggest that things are moving, creating a new context, which things are moving in a different direction. But I still insist on the extraordinary achievement of the issue. I think it would be a pity, because we are aware of money that's brought in from outside over a particular period, to not to acknowledge the achievement of 150 years in building. Your second point, yes, it was about the blasphemy. Apparently, I think the whole thing is ridiculous. I think usually accusations of blasphemy are often about people trying to assert authority, or about someone trying to grab someone's property. There are all sorts of venal processes underpinning accusations of blasphemy. Certainly that's my reading. But are you concerned to make a larger point?
The point would be that despite from what I've read, at least specific human rights reports by Pakistani groups and international groups, has brought up a teacher wants a job with another teacher, a blasphemy issue arises, that other teacher is eliminated, the former teacher gets the job. That was the famous case of the man called Mushtaq, who is alleged to have made the initial plan, and no Mushtaq be found that would have been relevant to the process. But my point is, if this seems to be why would the majority of Pakistanis, again, reported be in favor of a blasphemy code and be against reforming it, given the fact that it seems to be used in the most irresponsible and mean ways. Even if one thought that...
Okay, well, it's not what I'm talking about today, but I would say a lot of people are very frightened. That's an issue, as indeed Salman Taseer did, and will likely continue. And this is a society in which no one has any faith in the police. You're really on your own. And if you're a wise person, you keep quiet.
But I guess just to try to clarify my point one more time, if there is a movement from below that still is strong, that insists upon careful scholarship and careful study, personal responsibility, conscience, and humility, why isn't that movement making its presence known to defend those who have been intimidated by this use of blasphemy
It's very interesting. I would suggest that perhaps this movement below, which has created very considerable professional differences, is perhaps hasn't infused society as deeply as one might think. So you don't have all those qualities that I'm talking about as widespread as you wish. I suspect that's where the answer is.
Just one point.
Yes. Before we take perhaps a final question, I would like to remind everyone that there is a reception and that we can continue our discussion informally, and the reception would be downstairs in the common room. So please join us there. And did you want to? Okay. So it's a pleasure to thank you for a really talk. And as you can see, one that generated a very engaged and lively discussion. Thank you very much.